Good evening, and welcome back to Blood Moon Stories. Tonight, we leave the haunted highways and venture into the vast, majestic wilderness of America's national parks. These are lands preserved for their breathtaking beauty, places where millions go to reconnect with nature, to hike scenic trails, and to camp under a canopy of brilliant stars. But these ancient lands hold secrets far older than the parks themselves. They are places of profound silence, deep woods, and shadows that have never known the touch of electric light. We bring you 8 chilling true national park horror stories. These are not campfire tales told to spook children. These are the documented, terrifying experiences of park rangers, seasoned backpackers, wildlife biologists, and search and rescue teams. They are the official reports that are filed away, the personal journals that are hidden in drawers, and the hushed warnings shared between those who have stared into the primordial darkness of the backcountry and seen something stare back. From the misty peaks of the Great Smoky Mountains to the sun-scorched canyons of Zion and the dense, endless forests of Yellowstone, these accounts reveal a disturbing truth. We are never truly alone in the wild. Some things that live in these protected lands are not listed in any guidebook. They are entities that defy classification, beings that can mimic human voices, move with impossible speed, and whose very presence can make the forest fall silent. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe to Blood Moon Stories for your weekly journey into the unexplained. Hit that notification bell so you are always warned before you step off the beaten path. Now check your gear, fill your canteen, and follow us onto the trail. We're heading deep into the heart of America's most beautiful and terrifying landscapes, where the trail markers can lead you astray and the call of the wild might be the last thing you ever hear. Story 1. The Silence of Cades Cove. Our first account comes from a former park ranger named David, a man who dedicated 25 years of his life to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. David was a man of the mountains, born and raised in the shadow of the Smokies. He was a pragmatist, a man who believed in science, animal behavior, and the predictable patterns of nature. He had dealt with aggressive bears, rescued dozens of lost hikers, and knew every trail and hollow in his district. He thought he understood the forest's language, its moods, and its dangers. But an incident in the autumn of 2014 during a routine patrol in the Cades Cove area taught him that the oldest parts of the park speak a language that no human is meant to comprehend. Cades Cove is one of the most popular destinations in the entire national park system. It's a broad, verdant valley surrounded by majestic mountains, famous for its well-preserved historical buildings and abundant wildlife. Millions of tourists drive the 11-mile loop road every year, hoping to catch a glimpse of white-tailed deer, black bears, or wild turkeys. But beyond the bustling loop road lies the backcountry, a vast and rugged wilderness accessible only by foot. It was in this deeper, less traveled part of the cove that David's understanding of the world was irrevocably shattered. The incident began with a series of strange reports from seasoned backpackers. Over a period of 2 weeks in late October, several different groups hiking the trails branching off from the cove reported the same unsettling phenomenon: an unnatural, total silence. It wasn't the usual quiet of the deep woods, it was an absolute void of sound. No bird song, no insect buzz, no rustle of squirrels in the leaves, not even the whisper of wind through the trees. They described it as walking into a vacuum, a dead zone where the very air seemed to have been stripped of its ability to carry sound. The silence was so profound and so unnerving that all the reporting parties had cut their trips short, overcome by a sense of being watched by something they couldn't see or hear. David and his partner, a younger, more skeptical ranger named Ben, were assigned to investigate. Their official task was to check for environmental anomalies, Perhaps a localized gas leak or an unusual atmospheric condition that could be affecting wildlife and sound propagation. Unofficially, they were looking for any signs of illegal poaching or trapping, as a sudden silence in the woods is often a sign that a predator, human or otherwise, is active in the area. They started their patrol early on a crisp, clear Wednesday morning, parking their truck at the trailhead for Abrams Falls and heading deep into the backcountry. For the first few miles, everything was normal. The forest was alive with the typical sounds of autumn, the chatter of squirrels gathering nuts, the distant drumming of a pileated woodpecker, the rustle of dry leaves under their boots. The air was clean and smelled of damp earth and decaying pine needles. They reached the area where the reports had originated, a dense, old-growth section of forest about 5 miles from the loop road, around noon. And that's when it happened. It wasn't a gradual change, it was instantaneous. One moment the forest was filled with sound, the next it was utterly silent. It was as if someone had flipped a switch, cutting off all noise. The silence was a physical presence pressing in on them, making the air feel thick and heavy. David could hear the blood pounding in his own ears, a sound he was normally never aware of. Even their own footsteps on the leaf-littered ground seemed muffled and distant. Ben, ever the skeptic, tried to rationalize it. Weird inversion layer, maybe? Trapping all the sound. But David knew better. He had spent his entire life in these mountains and had never experienced anything like this. This wasn't a natural phenomenon. This was an enforced silence. They continued walking, their senses on high alert. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. It was a palpable, prickling sensation on the back of David's neck. They saw wildlife, deer standing motionless in the undergrowth, a flock of turkeys frozen mid-stride, a black bear halfway up a tree, all of them completely still and silent like taxidermy exhibits in a natural history museum. Their eyes, wide and terrified, all seemed to be fixed on a single point in the woods, somewhere just beyond David and Ben's line of sight. Following the terrified gaze of the animals, they pushed deeper into the silent woods, leaving the marked trail. They found a small, hidden clearing they had never seen before, despite having patrolled this area for years. In the center of the clearing stood a circle of 9 large, moss-covered stones arranged with a precision that could not have been natural. They were not native to the area. They were a dark, volcanic rock, unlike the sandstone and shale common to the Smokies. In the very center of the stone circle, the ground was bare, a perfect circle of dark, packed earth where nothing grew. As they stood at the edge of the clearing, the silence was broken by a single soft sound. A voice. It was a woman's voice, humming a gentle melodic tune, an old Appalachian lullaby that David's grandmother used to sing to him as a child. The sound was coming from the center of the stone circle, but there was no one there. Ben drew his service weapon. "Park Ranger! Identify yourself!" he shouted, his voice sounding strangely flat and dead in the oppressive silence. The humming stopped. For a long moment there was nothing. Then the voice spoke, and it was no longer humming. It was imitating Ben's shout, but with a subtle, terrifying difference. It was a perfect mimic of his voice, his pitch, his cadence. But it was hollow, empty of life. "Park Ranger, identify yourself," the voice echoed back from the empty circle. Then it began to speak again, this time using David's voice. It called out Ben's name. "Ben, it's okay. Put the gun down. It's just me." But David was standing right next to him, his own mouth clamped shut in terror. The entity in the circle began to cycle through voices, a horrifying Rolodex of sounds it had apparently collected. It used the voice of the park's chief ranger, the voice of the dispatcher they had spoken to that morning. And then, most chillingly, the voice of a little girl who had gone missing in the park 5 years earlier and had never been found. "Can you help me?" The little girl's voice pleaded from the empty air. I'm lost. Suddenly, the ground in the center of the circle began to move. The dark, packed earth started to churn and writhe, and from it rose a figure. It was not human. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs long and jointed like an insect's. Its skin was the color and texture of wet, decaying leaves, and it seemed to have no face, just a smooth, blank surface. As it rose to its full height of nearly 8 feet, it raised one of its long, spindly arms and pointed directly at them. And then it spoke, not with a single voice, but with all the voices at once. A cacophony of dozens of different people, men, women, and children, all speaking the same words in a horrifying, layered chorus. You are not welcome here. The silence shattered. The forest erupted in a deafening roar of sound, every bird, every insect, every animal screaming at once. The sound was a physical assault, so loud and disorienting that both David and Ben staggered back, clutching their ears. They turned and ran, crashing blindly through the undergrowth, fleeing from the clearing and the impossible thing that had risen from the earth. They didn't stop running until they were back on the marked trail and the normal sounds of the forest had returned. They never spoke of what they saw in that clearing, not in their official report. They logged the incident as an unexplained wildlife behavior event and recommended the area be closed for further ecological study. The backcountry trails in that section of Cades Cove were quietly and permanently rerouted the following season, with the old paths allowed to become overgrown and disappear. The official reason given was bear activity and trail erosion. David put in for early retirement 6 months later. The mountains he had loved his entire life now felt alien and menacing. He could no longer find peace in their quiet spaces because he knew that some silences are not peaceful. Some silences are waiting. He learned that day that the Great Smoky Mountains National Park is a preserve for more than just flora and fauna. It is a sanctuary for things far older, things that were there long before the first trees, things that can wear the voices of the lost like a cloak and command the very silence of the forest. And they do not like to be disturbed. Story 2, The Visitor at Zion. Our second story takes us from the dense, misty forests of the Appalachians to the stark, sun-scorched beauty of Zion National Park in Utah. It comes from a young woman named Chloe, an avid rock climber and canyoneer who, in the summer of 2019, had an encounter in one of Zion's remote slot canyons that forever changed her relationship with the wild. Chloe was not a casual tourist. She was an experienced and highly skilled adventurer. She understood the desert's unforgiving nature, the flash floods, the extreme temperatures, the deceptive distances. She treated the wilderness with a deep and abiding respect, but she did not fear it. That would change. She had obtained a coveted permit to do a solo 3-day trek through the subway, a semi-technical canyoneering route famous for its stunning tube-like rock formations. It's a challenging journey that requires rappelling, swimming through frigid pools of water, and navigating miles of rugged, unmarked terrain. Doing it solo was a testament to her skill and confidence. She was fully prepared, carrying a dry bag with her gear, a satellite messenger for emergencies, and enough food and water for an extra day just in case. The first day of the trek was magnificent. The sheer sandstone walls of the canyon, streaked with millennia of desert varnish, rose hundreds of feet on either side of her, creating a cathedral of stone. The light filtered down, painting the canyon floor in shifting patterns of gold and crimson. The only sounds were the gurgle of the left fork of North Creek, the whisper of the wind through the narrow passages, and the echo of her own footsteps. It was a perfect, profound solitude. She made camp the first night on a small, sandy bank, well above the creek's high water mark. As darkness fell, the canyon became a different world. The temperature dropped and the stars emerged with a brilliance that city dwellers can only dream of, a dense, glittering river of light against the blackest of skies. Chloe felt a deep sense of peace, a feeling of being a small but welcome part of this immense ancient landscape. The feeling of being welcome did not last. She was awakened in the middle of the night by a sound. It was a soft, rhythmic scraping coming from just outside her small one-person tent. Scrape pause. Scrape. It sounded like someone or something was dragging a stick or a rock across the sandstone. Her heart began to pound. Her first thought was an animal. A ring-tailed cat, a coyote, maybe even a mountain lion, though they were rare in the canyon depths. She lay perfectly still listening, her ears straining against the silence between the sounds. The scraping stopped. It was replaced by a new sound, one that made the blood freeze in her veins. It was the soft, unmistakable sound of a zipper. Not her tent zipper, but the zipper on her backpack, which she had left just outside her tent door. She could hear the slow, deliberate pull of the metal teeth, followed by the rustle of her dry bags as something rummaged through her gear. This was not an animal. An animal might tear at a pack, drawn by the scent of food, but it wouldn't operate a zipper. This was intelligent. This was human. "Hey!" she yelled, her voice a raw croak of fear. "Who's out there? This is my campsite. Get away from my gear." The rustling stopped instantly. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy, and menacing. She held her breath, waiting. After a long, tense minute, she heard a soft, shuffling sound moving away from her tent, fading into the darkness. She stayed awake for the rest of the night, clutching a can of bear spray in one hand and her satellite messenger in the other. Her eyes wide in the dark, every nerve screaming. At first light, she cautiously unzipped her tent. Her backpack was open, its contents neatly laid out on the sand, as if for inspection. Her food bags, her climbing gear, her first aid kit, all of it was undisturbed, nothing taken. It wasn't a thief. It was something else, something curious. As she was repacking her gear, she noticed a set of footprints in the sand leading away from her campsite. They were not human. They were long and narrow, with 3 sharp, claw-like toes and a deeply impressed heel. They looked almost reptilian, like the tracks of some large bipedal lizard. But they were fresh. Shaken but determined not to let the incident ruin her trip, Chloe pressed on. She told herself it was another canyoneer playing a sick prank, though she knew that explanation didn't fit the strange tracks. The second day was a grueling series of swims through icy pools and rappels down short, steep drops. The beauty of the canyon was now tinged with a creeping sense of dread. Every shadow seemed to hold a watching presence. Every echo sounded like a footstep behind her. She made camp the second night in a more defensive position, on a high ledge with a clear view of the approaches. She brought her pack and all her gear inside the tent with her. But sleep offered no escape. She was plagued by nightmares, strange, disjointed visions of the canyon walls shifting and changing, of whispers in a language she didn't understand, and of a tall, thin figure watching her from the canyon rim, its form silhouetted against the stars. She woke up just before dawn with a gasp, the last vestiges of the nightmare clinging to her like a shroud. And she knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that she was not alone in the tent. The air was cold and still, and there was a faint, unpleasant smell like wet clay and ozone. She didn't dare move. She could feel a subtle weight on the foot of her sleeping bag, the same pressure she imagined a cat might make, but heavier, more solid. She could hear that same slow, ragged breathing from the night before, but this time it was inside with her. She lay paralyzed for what felt like an eternity, her mind a maelstrom of terror. Then a voice spoke right next to her ear. It was a whisper, dry and sibilant, like sand skittering over rock, and it spoke in her own voice. "Are you lost?" it whispered, a perfect hollow mimicry of her own tone and inflection. Chloe screamed, a raw, primal sound of pure terror that was swallowed by the stone walls of the canyon. She thrashed wildly, kicking and scrambling, and her hand hit the zipper of the tent door. She tore it open and tumbled out onto the cold sand, crab-walking backward, away from the tent. In the faint pre-dawn light, she saw it emerge. It unfolded itself from the tiny tent in a way that was geometrically impossible, its limbs bending and extending at angles that defied anatomy. It was tall, at least 7 feet, and painfully thin, its body a skeletal framework covered in tight gray, leathery skin that seemed to shift in color, camouflaging itself against the rock. Its head was long and narrow, with no discernible nose or mouth, but 2 large, black obsidian eyes that reflected the dim light with a dead, insect-like sheen. It stood on 2 long, digitigrade legs that ended in those same 3-toed, clawed feet she had seen the tracks of. It tilted its head, regarding her with a chillingly analytical curiosity. Then it spoke again, this time in the voice of the park ranger who had checked her permit at the trailhead 2 days earlier. "Ma'am, you need to stay on the designated route," it said, the friendly professional voice a grotesque mismatch for the monstrous form it came from. Then it did the most terrifying thing of all. It raised one of its long 3-fingered hands and pointed at a series of petroglyphs carved into the canyon wall nearby. Ancient art left by the ancestral Puebloans 1,000 years ago. The creature began to touch the symbols one by one. As it touched each carving, a spiral, a human figure, a bighorn sheep, it would speak, its voice changing with each touch. It mimicked the sound of the wind, the gurgle of the creek, the cry of a hawk, and then the voices of other hikers it had apparently encountered, a horrifying collection of audio souvenirs. "What a beautiful view," said a man's voice. "I think we're lost," said a woman's, filled with panic. "Johnny, get back from the edge," shouted another. Chloe realized what it was. It was a mimic, a recorder, an entity that learned about the world by sampling its sounds. And it was learning about her. With a final surge of adrenaline, she scrambled to her feet and ran. She didn't grab her pack, her gear, or her satellite messenger. She just ran, blindly, downstream, slipping on wet rocks, splashing through the creek, her only thought to put distance between herself and that impossible thing. She could hear it behind her for a time, not running but making a series of rapid, clicking sounds like a Geiger counter. She ran for miles, long after her lungs burned and her legs screamed in protest. She finally stumbled upon another group of hikers near the end of the route, a family of 4 who stared in shock at the wild-eyed, hysterical woman who had just appeared out of the wilderness, babbling about a monster in her tent. A search and rescue team was sent back to her campsite later that day. They found her tent and all her gear completely undisturbed. There were no strange tracks, no evidence of anything unusual. The official report listed the incident as a panic attack induced by exhaustion and dehydration. They said she had likely been spooked by an animal and had imagined the rest. But Chloe knows what she saw. She quit climbing. She sold her canyoneering gear. She moved to the Midwest, as far from the canyons and mountains as she could get. She is still haunted by the memory of that creature unfolding itself from her tent, by the sound of her own voice whispering in the dark, and by the chilling realization that some of the most beautiful places on Earth are home to visitors who have been there far longer than us. Silent observers who watch from the shadows, listen to our voices, and sometimes come into our tents at night to learn what it sounds like to be human. Story 3. The Whispers of Yellowstone. Our third story comes from the vast geothermal heart of Yellowstone National Park. It's a place of dramatic contrasts, where stunning natural beauty coexists with the raw, violent power of the earth. The account is from a wildlife biologist named Dr. Alistair Finch, a man of science and reason who in the winter of 2016 was tasked with a study that brought him face to face with a phenomenon that defied every principle of biology and physics he had dedicated his life to understanding. Alistair was a specialist in wolf behavior, and he was leading a small research team on a winter study of the Lamar Valley wolf packs. Winter in Yellowstone is a brutal, magical season. The crowds are gone, the landscape is buried under a thick blanket of snow, and the park returns to a primal state. For researchers, it's the best time to observe wildlife. The animals are more visible against the white landscape, and their behavior is stripped down to the essentials of survival. Alistair's team, consisting of himself, a graduate student named Kenji, and a seasoned Park Service tracker named Elias, was based out of a remote, rustic ranger cabin deep in the Lamar Valley, accessible only by snowmobile. Their mission was to track the Junction Butte Pack, collaring several individuals and observing their hunting patterns in the harsh winter conditions. For the first 2 weeks, the study proceeded as expected. They spent their days on snowmobiles or snowshoes, tracking the pack, their nights in the cabin, analyzing data and listening to the distant haunting howls of the wolves under the brilliant cold stars. The strangeness began subtly. It started with the radio collars. The GPS data from several of the collared wolves began to show impossible movements. One wolf, a large alpha male they had been tracking for days, would suddenly appear on the GPS map miles away from its last known location, a distance it could not possibly have covered in the few minutes between satellite pings. At first, Alistair blamed it on equipment malfunction. The extreme cold was known to wreak havoc on electronics. He made a note to have the collars recalibrated. But then came the audio anomalies. The collars were also equipped with sensitive microphones, allowing the team to record the wolves' vocalizations. When Kenji was reviewing the audio from the previous night, he called Alistair over, his face pale with confusion. "You need to hear this," he said, and played the recording. It was the sound of the pack howling, a familiar wild chorus, but underneath the howls, almost too faint to hear, was something else. It was a voice, a human voice, whispering. The words were indistinct, a soft, sibilant murmur that seemed to be woven into the very fabric of the wolves' howls. They checked other recordings from different wolves from different nights. It was there, too, a faint whispering voice that rose and fell with the cadence of the howling. Elias, the tracker, a man of Shoshone descent who had spent his entire life in and around Yellowstone, was not surprised. He listened to the recording, his face grim. "It is the mimic of the steam," he said quietly. "My grandfather used to tell stories of it, a spirit that lives in the geyser basins. It has no voice of its own, so it borrows the sounds of the park, the wind, the water, the animals, and sometimes the people." Alistair, a man who dealt in facts and data, dismissed it as superstition, suggesting it was radio interference or some kind of acoustic anomaly caused by the geothermal features of the park. But he couldn't shake the deep sense of unease the recordings gave him. The next day, the alpha male's collar went silent. The GPS signal simply vanished. This was highly unusual. The collars were built to be incredibly durable. Elias, using his traditional tracking skills, led them to the wolf's last known location near the edge of the Midway Geyser Basin. The area was a treacherous, otherworldly landscape of steaming fumaroles, bubbling mud pots, and brilliantly colored hot springs, their vibrant blues and oranges a stark contrast to the white snow. They found the wolf's tracks in the snow. They led directly to the edge of the Grand Prismatic Spring, the largest hot spring in the United States, a massive steaming pool of superheated water, famous for its rainbow-colored rings of thermophilic bacteria. The tracks went to the very edge of the fragile mineral-crusted ground, and then they stopped. There were no tracks leading away. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no drag marks. The wolf had simply walked to the edge of the boiling spring and vanished. As they stood there, baffled and disturbed, a thick plume of steam billowed up from the center of the spring, and from within the steam they heard it again. The whispering. This time it was clearer. It was Alistair's voice. "The data is compromised," it whispered, a perfect mimic of his own voice from a conversation he'd had with Kenji back at the cabin the night before. Then it used Kenji's voice. "Should we abort the study?" Finally it spoke in Elias's deep, quiet tone. "It is too late for that." The three men stood frozen, their breath pluming in the frigid air. The steam swirled, and for a moment they saw a shape within it. A tall, wavering, indistinct figure that seemed to be made of the steam itself. A humanoid form that had no substance. Then it was gone. They retreated to the cabin, their scientific mission forgotten, replaced by a primal fear. That night the real horror began. The whispers surrounded the cabin. They came from the chimney, from the cracks in the window frames, from the floorboards. The entity was no longer just mimicking their past conversations. It was speaking to them directly, using their own voices to taunt and terrorize them. It used Alistair's voice to question his own scientific conclusions, quoting passages from his published papers and then twisting them into nonsense. It used Kenji's voice to speak of his fears of failure, his anxieties about his academic career, whispering doubts that he had only ever confided to his personal journal. It used Elias's voice to chant old Shoshone prayers, but it got the words wrong, perverting them into something blasphemous. It was trying to drive them mad, turning their own thoughts and voices against them. The most terrifying part was its intelligence. It wasn't just repeating sounds, it was understanding them, contextualizing them, and using them with a cruel psychological precision. By the third day of this siege, they were at their breaking point, sleep-deprived and paranoid. The storm had worsened, making a snowmobile journey out of the valley impossible. They were trapped. Alistair, in a desperate attempt to re-establish a sense of scientific order, decided to try and communicate with the entity. He set up a sensitive parabolic microphone and a speaker outside the cabin. "Who are you?" He broadcasted into the storm, his voice shaking. The response was immediate. The speaker crackled and a voice came through, but it was not one of theirs. It was a voice from the past, the crackly, tinny voice of a man from an old radio broadcast. "This is the WPA Yellowstone expedition of 1938, the voice said. "We have discovered a new form of life. It communicates through vapor, through sound." The broadcast was cut off by a burst of static and a scream. The entity was a library of lost sounds, a collector of voices from everyone who had ever passed through its territory. It had been listening, learning for decades, perhaps centuries. It was Elias who finally formulated a plan. He remembered his grandfather's stories. The mimic was a creature of sound and steam. It had no physical form and could not interact with the physical world directly, only through influence and fear. Its weakness, the stories said, was silence. Absolute silence. Their plan was desperate. They would make a run for it on the snowmobiles, but they would do it in complete silence. They disconnected the engine's spark plugs, planning to coast downhill as far as they could before they had to start the noisy machines. They would not speak. They would not even whisper. They waited for a lull in the storm just before dawn. They pushed the heavy snowmobiles out of the small garage, their movements muffled by the deep snow. As they began to glide silently down the long, sloping valley, the whispers started again, frantic and angry. The entity knew they were leaving. It threw every voice it had at them. It screamed in their own voices, pleaded in the voices of their loved ones, mimicked the sounds of their snowmobile engines failing, of trees crashing down, of avalanches roaring towards them. It created a symphony of auditory illusions, a desperate, terrifying assault on their senses. They ignored it all, their faces set, their eyes fixed on the path ahead. They coasted for nearly 5 miles in absolute disciplined silence. As they reached the edge of the geyser basin's influence, the whispers began to fade, growing thin and stretched, like a radio signal losing its station. With one final desperate effort, the entity played its last card. A voice filled the air, a voice that none of them recognized, but one that was filled with an authority and power that made them all flinch. It wasn't a whisper. It was a clear, booming, resonant command that seemed to come from the sky itself. Stop. For a heart-stopping moment, they all hesitated, but Elias urged them on, his eyes wide with a terror that was deeper than anything Alistair had yet seen. They reconnected the spark plugs and fired up the engines. The roar of the 2-stroke motors shattered the silence, a defiant human noise against the ancient power of the park. They didn't look back. They drove for hours, not stopping until they reached the main park road and the safety of the ranger station at Mammoth Hot Springs. The official report cited extreme weather conditions and equipment failure as the reasons for aborting the study. The missing wolf was listed as presumed deceased due to geothermal activity. There was no mention of the whispers, of the steam figure, of the voices of the dead. Alistair Finch never returned to Yellowstone. He resigned his position at the university and took a teaching job at a small college in a quiet part of New England, far from the wild, powerful places of the world. He learned that winter that some scientific truths are not found in data or observation, but in the stories passed down by those who have lived alongside the darkness for generations. He learned that in the heart of Yellowstone, where the earth breathes steam and water, there exists a form of consciousness that is ancient, intelligent, and utterly alien. A consciousness that listens, learns, and waits in the silence for new voices to add to its terrible, lonely collection. Story 4. The Glare on Angel's Landing. Our 4th story brings us back to the towering sandstone cliffs of Zion National Park, to one of its most famous and notoriously dangerous trails. Angel's Landing. This account comes from a man named Jacob, a former EMT who in the summer of 2018 volunteered for a search and rescue operation that forced him to confront a horror far more terrifying than the trail's dizzying heights. Angel's Landing is not a hike for the faint of heart. The final half-mile is a perilous scramble along a narrow knife-edge ridge with sheer 1,000-foot drops on either side. Hikers must cling to chains bolted into the rock as they navigate the exposed spine to the summit. It's a trail that demands absolute focus and respect. It has claimed more than a dozen lives over the years, a grim statistic that every hiker is aware of as they begin the ascent. The call came in on a sweltering August afternoon. A young man, a college student from Germany named Klaus, had become separated from his friends during the final ascent to the summit. His friends had waited for him, but he never appeared. They had last seen him near Scout Lookout, just before the chained section begins. He was an experienced hiker, well-equipped, and in good physical condition. He had simply vanished on one of the most popular and heavily trafficked trails in the park. Jacob, who was on vacation in the area, was an experienced climber and had hiked Angel's Landing many times. He volunteered his services and was quickly integrated into the park's SAR team. The search began immediately, but it was hampered by the terrain. The sheer cliffs and deep, inaccessible canyons surrounding the trail made a comprehensive ground search nearly impossible. The initial focus was on the trail itself and the immediate areas below the exposed sections, the grim task of looking for any sign that Klaus had fallen. They searched until darkness forced them to stop, finding no trace of the missing hiker, no dropped water bottle, no stray piece of gear, nothing. The next morning, the search expanded. A helicopter was brought in to scan the cliffs, and teams of technical climbers prepared to rappel down the sheer rock faces. Jacob was assigned to a small team tasked with rehiking the trail, this time moving slowly, meticulously examining every crevice and ledge, and interviewing any hikers who might have seen something the previous day. It was during this second sweep that Jacob noticed the first strange detail. He was speaking to a couple who had been on the summit around the time Klaus disappeared. "Did you see a young man, blonde hair, wearing a blue shirt?" Jacob asked, showing them a photo of Klaus. The woman nodded. "Yes, I think so. He was acting strangely." "Strangely how?" Jacob pressed. "He was talking to someone," the woman's husband added. But there was no one there. He was standing right at the edge near the summit, having a very animated conversation with thin air. We thought maybe he was on a Bluetooth headset, but he wasn't wearing one. It was unsettling, so we gave him a wide berth. Jacob thanked them and made a note. It could be a sign of heat stroke, dehydration, or a psychological break. All real dangers on a strenuous hike in the desert heat. But it was a lead. As Jacob and his team reached the final chained section of the trail, they were forced to move in single file. The path was barely a few feet wide in places, the rock dropping away into a dizzying void on both sides. It was here that Jacob felt it for the first time, the distinct, unnerving sensation of being watched. It wasn't the casual glances of other hikers. This was a focused, intense, and malevolent glare. He scanned the cliffs above and the canyon below, but he could see nothing but rock, sky, and the distant ribbon of the Virgin River. He tried to shake it off as nerves, the inherent stress of the dangerous location and the grim task at hand. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger as they ascended. He noticed that his team members were also on edge, constantly glancing over their shoulders, their professional focus tinged with a nervous apprehension. They reached the summit, a stunning 360-degree panorama of the entire canyon. It was also a place of profound exposure and danger. The team spread out, again searching for any clue. It was then that Jacob saw him. Perched on a narrow, inaccessible pinnacle of rock about 100 yards away, across a chasm of empty air, was a figure. It was too far to make out details, but it was clearly a person, sitting with their legs dangling over the abyss, watching them. The figure was unnaturally still, a dark silhouette against the bright blue sky. "Hey!" Jacob yelled, his voice carrying in the thin air. "We're with Search and Rescue." "Did you see a missing hiker up here yesterday?" The figure didn't respond. It didn't move. It just sat there, watching. Jacob raised his binoculars, his hands trembling slightly. As he brought the figure into focus, a wave of nausea and disbelief washed over him. The figure was Klaus, the missing hiker. He was wearing the same blue shirt and hiking shorts from the photograph, but something was terribly, fundamentally wrong. His posture was unnatural, his limbs bent at angles that looked painful and disjointed, like a badly broken marionette. And his face. His face was a mask of pure, ecstatic terror. His eyes were wide, impossibly wide, and his mouth was stretched open in a silent, screaming grin that split his face from ear to ear. He was staring directly at Jacob, directly through the binoculars, as if he could see Jacob looking at him. But he wasn't alone. Standing behind him with one long, slender hand resting on Klaus's shoulder was another figure. This one was tall and emaciated, its skin the color of the red sandstone, making it almost perfectly camouflaged against the rock. It had no discernible features, no eyes, no nose, no mouth, just a smooth, blank, oblong head that tilted with a bird-like curiosity. Its body was long and thin, a stick figure of a creature that seemed to be made of the rock and the heat haze itself. As Jacob watched, paralyzed with horror, the blank-faced creature leaned forward, its featureless head moving close to Klaus's ear as if whispering to him. Klaus's silent, screaming grin widened, and a single tear traced a path through the dust on his cheek. "I've got him," Jacob croaked into his radio, his voice cracking. "He's on the east pinnacle. But he's not alone." Before the dispatcher could respond, the creature on the pinnacle seemed to notice Jacob. It straightened up, its blank face turning slowly to fix on Jacob's position. Even from 100 yards away, Jacob felt the full force of its attention, a malevolent psychic pressure that made his head spin and his vision swim. The feeling of being watched intensified 1,000-fold, becoming a physical weight, a crushing, hateful glare that promised annihilation. The creature raised its other hand and pointed a long, bony finger directly at Jacob. And then it smiled. A thin black line split across the lower half of its blank face, a lipless slit that opened to reveal a row of needle-sharp crystalline teeth that glittered in the harsh sunlight. The helicopter, which had been searching the lower canyons, was diverted to Jacob's position. As it approached the pinnacle, the creature reacted. It wrapped its long, spindly arms around the still grinning Klaus, and with a movement that was impossibly fast, it simply stepped backward, off the pinnacle and into the 1,000-foot abyss. The SAR team watched in stunned silence as the two figures plummeted, not falling like normal bodies, but tumbling with a strange, leaf-like grace. They did not scream. They simply fell, disappearing into the deep shadows of the canyon below. The recovery operation was grim. It took the technical climbing team the rest of the day to rappel down to the spot where the figures had landed. They found the body of Klaus, his limbs broken and twisted, but the horrific, ecstatic grin still frozen on his face. The coroner's report would later state that despite the catastrophic injuries from the fall, the actual cause of death was a massive simultaneous coronary and cerebral hemorrhage. A heart attack and a stroke. He had literally died of fright before he ever hit the ground. Of the other creature there was no trace, no body, no blood, no tracks, nothing. It was as if it had simply evaporated upon impact. The official story was that Klaus, likely suffering from heat stroke and dehydration, had become disoriented and delusional. He had been seen talking to himself, had wandered off the trail to a dangerous, inaccessible spot, and had tragically fallen while the rescue helicopter was approaching. Jacob's account of the second figure was officially dismissed as a misidentification, a trick of the light and the stress of the situation. He was quietly and firmly advised to amend his report. Jacob quit the SAR team a week later. He couldn't shake the image of Klaus's screaming grin or the memory of that featureless face turning to fix its hateful glare on him. He had felt its presence, its pure, unadulterated malice. He came to believe that Angel's Landing was haunted, not by a ghost, but by something far worse, a predator. An entity that didn't just cause people to fall, but that fed on their terror, drawing them to the edge, whispering to them, showing them things that would make their hearts and minds explode, and then watching them fall with a connoisseur's appreciation for their final silent scream. He realized that the danger of Angel's Landing wasn't just the fall. The real danger was the thing that pushes you. Story 5, The Thing That Wears the Deer. Our fifth story takes us to the dense ancient forests of Shenandoah National Park in Virginia. This account comes from a man named Connor, a seasoned bow hunter who, during a solo hunting trip in the autumn of 2020, encountered a creature that shattered his understanding of the natural world and left him with a fear of the deep woods that haunts him to this day. Connor was not a novice. He had been hunting in the Shenandoah backcountry since he was a boy, taught by his father and grandfather. He was an expert tracker, a skilled archer, and a man who felt more at home in the wilderness than in any city. He understood the rhythms of the forest, the behavior of its animals, and the unwritten rules of survival. He was there for the park's annual managed deer hunt, an event designed to control the deer population, and he had secured a permit for a remote, rarely visited section of the park's southern district. He set up his base camp in a small, secluded hollow miles from the nearest road or trail. It was a place he knew well, a place where he had successfully hunted for years. The first 2 days of his trip were peaceful and uneventful. The autumn foliage was at its peak, a breathtaking tapestry of red, orange, and gold. The air was crisp and clean, and the forest was alive with the sounds of wildlife preparing for the coming winter. On the third morning, Connor was perched in his tree stand before dawn. A small platform secured 20 feet up a large oak tree overlooking a game trail. He was perfectly still, a silent, camouflaged predator waiting for the forest to awaken. As the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the canopy, he saw it. A large, magnificent buck stepped silently onto the trail below him. It was a trophy animal, with a massive rack of antlers and a thick, healthy coat. Any hunter would have considered it the buck of a lifetime, but as Connor slowly raised his bow, taking aim, he noticed something was wrong. The deer's movements were unnatural. It wasn't walking with the fluid, cautious grace of a wild animal. Its gait was stiff, jerky, and slightly uneven, as if it were struggling to coordinate its limbs. It moved with the awkwardness of a puppet, not a living creature. He lowered his bow, his hunter's instincts replaced by a growing sense of confusion and unease. He watched the deer through his binoculars. Its head was tilted at an odd, painful-looking angle, and its eyes, which should have been soft and brown, were wide and filled with a look of sheer, frozen terror. It was as if the deer was a prisoner in its own body, forced to move against its will. Then he saw the reason. From behind the deer, 2 long, impossibly thin, stick-like arms emerged, wrapped around the deer's torso. They were a pale, sickly white, the color of bone or fungus, and they ended in long, needle-sharp fingers that were dug deep into the deer's hide. The arms were connected to a figure that was crouched behind the buck, using it like a walking blind, a grotesque suit of living camouflage. The figure slowly straightened up, and Connor had to stifle a gasp of horror. It was tall and emaciated, a skeletal, being that seemed to be made of stretched sinew and pale, hairless skin. Its legs were long and jointed backward, like a bird's, and it moved with a silent, predatory grace. But its head was the most terrifying part. It had no discernible features, no eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just a smooth, blank, white surface, like an unfinished mannequin's head. The creature was wearing the deer. It had its arms wrapped around the animal's chest, and its blank head was tucked just behind the deer's neck. It was controlling the deer's movements, forcing it to walk along the trail, using the terrified animal as a disguise. Paralyzed by a mixture of fear and morbid fascination, Connor could only watch. The creature guided the deer down the trail until it stopped directly beneath his tree stand. It stood there for a long, silent moment. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, the creature's blank head tilted upward, its featureless face pointing directly at Connor's position in the tree. It couldn't have seen him. He was 20 feet up, wearing full camouflage, and hadn't moved a muscle. But it knew he was there. It had known all along. The entire procession had been a performance for his benefit. A thin black slit opened horizontally across the blank face, a lipless mouth that smiled a terrible, knowing smile. And then it spoke. Its voice was a dry, rasping whisper, a sound like dead leaves skittering across stone, but it formed perfect, chilling words. "Not this one," it whispered, the sound seeming to come from all directions at once. Then, with a sickening, wet, tearing sound, the creature's long fingers tightened. The magnificent buck gave a single, silent shudder, its legs buckling. It collapsed to the ground, its terrified eyes glazing over. The creature extracted its long, pale arms from the deer's body and let the carcass fall to the forest floor. It looked up at Connor one last time, its lipless mouth still stretched in that horrifying smile, and then it turned and melted back into the deep woods, disappearing into the shadows with an unnatural speed and silence. Connor stayed in his tree stand for hours, trembling uncontrollably, unable to move, unable to process what he had just witnessed. The dead buck lay below him, a grim testament to the reality of the encounter. When he finally found the strength to climb down, he didn't even bother to retrieve his gear. He left his bow, his pack, and the expensive tree stand where they were. He just ran. He ran until he reached his truck, his heart pounding with a terror he had never known. He drove straight to the nearest ranger station and tried to explain what he had seen. He sounded like a madman, and he knew it. He babbled about a monster wearing a deer, about a blank-faced creature that whispered from the woods. The rangers were polite but dismissive. They attributed his story to buck fever, a common phenomenon where hunters experience hallucinations and anxiety in the heat of the moment. They offered to send a ranger with him to retrieve his gear, but Connor refused. He would never set foot in that part of the forest again. The official report logged the incident as a hunter-induced stress event. The dead buck was eventually found by another hunter, and its death was attributed to a natural cause, perhaps a heart attack or a strange, unexplainable seizure. There was no mention of the real cause. Connor sold all of his hunting equipment. He gave up the pastime that had been a central part of his life and his family's heritage for generations. The joy was gone, replaced by a gnawing, visceral fear. He could no longer look at a deer without seeing the terror in its eyes, without imagining the pale, stick-like arms wrapped around its body. He understood now that in the deepest, oldest parts of the woods there are predators that hunters like him could never comprehend. They don't hunt for food or for sport. They hunt for other reasons, reasons that are ancient and alien. And sometimes they wear the skin of their prey, not to hide, but to put on a show for the terrified audience of one they have chosen in the silent, watching woods. He learned that the most dangerous thing in the forest isn't the predator you see, but the one that is looking through another creature's eyes. Story 6. The Laughter in the Redwoods. Our sixth story takes us to the misty primeval giants of Redwood National and State Parks in Northern California. This account comes from a soundscape ecologist named Dr. Aris Thorne, a man whose life's work was to listen to and preserve the natural sounds of the world's last quiet places. In the fall of 2021, during a research expedition to record the ambient sounds of an old-growth redwood forest, he captured a sound that was not on any acoustic index, a sound that suggested an ancient and deeply malevolent intelligence hiding among the silent, colossal trees. Aris was a purist. He believed that the natural soundscape or biophony of an ecosystem was as vital and as indicative of its health as its biodiversity. He had traveled the globe, from the Amazon rainforest to the Arctic tundra, with his highly specialized recording equipment, capturing the delicate symphony of the natural world. His project in the Redwoods was particularly important to him. He was attempting to create a baseline audio record of one of the quietest places in North America, a deep, protected grove of old-growth giants that was miles from any road and rarely visited by humans. His setup was complex. He and his small team of 2 graduate students, Maya and Ben, established a base camp and then spent days hiking into the remote grove to place a dozen sensitive, weatherproof microphones. These microphones were connected by shielded cables to a central recording unit, allowing Aris to capture a 360-degree immersive soundscape of the forest over a period of several weeks. The goal was to record the forest's natural rhythms, the subtle whisper of wind through the 1,000-year-old needles, The distant calls of spotted owls, the rustle of small mammals on the forest floor, all untouched by the noise of human activity. For the first week, the recordings were exactly what Aris had hoped for: pure, pristine, and deeply peaceful. He spent hours wearing his professional-grade headphones, listening to the live feed, feeling as though he was listening to the very breathing of the planet. The forest was a place of profound, cathedral-like silence, punctuated by the delicate sounds of its inhabitants. The anomaly began on the 8th night. Aris was monitoring the live feed from the cabin when he noticed a strange, recurring sound on the microphone array deepest in the grove. It was a soft, rhythmic clicking, almost like a metronome. Click, click, click. It was too regular to be an insect and too quiet to be a woodpecker. It had a strange, almost metallic quality, yet it also sounded organic. He isolated the microphones and tried to triangulate the sound's position, but the location seemed to be constantly shifting, moving between the microphones faster than any ground-based animal could travel. He mentioned it to Maya and Ben the next morning. Ben, a skeptic, suggested it was a technical glitch, perhaps a faulty cable or a microphone malfunction. Maya, who had grown up in the area and was familiar with local Yurok and Toloa tribal lore, was more concerned. She spoke of tree tappers, spirits of the deep forest that were said to communicate by knocking on the ancient trees. Aris, ever the scientist, made a note to check the equipment but privately dismissed the folklore. That night, the clicking sound returned, but it was different. It was louder, more insistent, and it was accompanied by a new sound, a low, guttural chuckle. It was a deep, throaty sound, like the laugh of a very large man, but it had a strange, resonant quality, as if it were echoing up from deep within the earth. The laugh would come in short, sharp bursts, always following a series of the rhythmic clicks. It was a call and response, a conversation. Aris was now deeply unsettled. He spent the entire night at his console, listening, trying to make sense of it. The laughter was not human. It was too deep, too powerful, and it carried an undertone of cruel, mocking amusement. It felt ancient and intelligent. He could hear it moving through the grove, the sound passing from one microphone to another, circling the entire area in a matter of minutes. The next day, the three of them hiked back into the grove to inspect the microphones and look for any physical evidence. The forest felt different. The usual ambient sounds were gone. The birds were silent. The squirrels were nowhere to be seen. A heavy, watchful silence had fallen over the grove, the same kind of silence a forest holds when a major predator like a mountain lion is on the prowl. They found no technical faults with the equipment, but they did find something else. At the Yadus base of one of the largest redwoods, a tree nearly 300 feet tall and over 1,000 years old, they found a series of strange markings carved into the thick, fibrous bark. The markings were not animal scratches. They were complex, geometric symbols arranged in a spiral pattern. They looked like a form of writing, but unlike any script Aris had ever seen. The carvings were fresh, the exposed wood still pale and raw. As they stood there examining the strange glyphs, they heard the chuckle again. This time it was broad daylight, and the sound was coming from directly above them, high up in the canopy of the giant redwood they were standing beside. It was loud, clear, and filled with a triumphant, mocking glee. They all looked up, but the dense canopy of needles hundreds of feet above obscured their view. They could see nothing but a dizzying lattice of branches against the sky. Then something small fell from the canopy and landed softly on the mossy ground at their feet. It was a small, hand-carved wooden bird, exquisitely detailed. It was a perfect replica of a Steller's jay, a common bird in the region. But as Ben reached down to pick it up, the laughter boomed again from above and the small wooden bird crumbled into a pile of fine, gray dust. That was enough. They packed up their equipment in a frantic hurry, their scientific mission abandoned in the face of a phenomenon that was clearly not scientific. As they worked, the laughter continued, echoing through the silent grove from all directions at once. It seemed to be toying with them, enjoying their fear. It would mimic the sound of a falling branch, causing them to jump and then follow it with a deep, rolling chuckle. It would imitate Ben's nervous cough, then Maya's sharp intake of breath, weaving their own sounds of fear into its terrifying performance. They practically ran the miles back to their base camp, the sound of the laughter following them, always keeping pace, a constant mocking presence at the edge of their hearing. They threw their gear into their vehicle and drove away without looking back. Back in his university lab, Aris analyzed the recordings with a mixture of scientific curiosity and pure dread. The acoustic analysis of the laughter was baffling. The sound waves were incredibly complex, containing frequencies that were both above and below the range of human hearing. The sound had a unique acoustic signature, but when he ran it through a source location algorithm, the software crashed. The sound, according to the data, was originating from multiple points simultaneously, a physical impossibility. But the most terrifying discovery came when he isolated and amplified the faint clicking sounds. They weren't random. They were a complex patterned language, a form of binary code, almost like a highly advanced Morse code. He spent weeks trying to decipher it, feeding it into every decryption program he had. He finally got a partial translation from a program designed to analyze prime numbers and complex mathematical sequences. The message was fragmented, but what he could piece together was horrifying. It wasn't a conversation between two entities. It was a single entity thinking to itself. The clicks were its internal monologue, its thoughts. The laughter was its external expression, its reaction to the world around it. And the translated clicks were not words, but concepts, pure mathematical and philosophical ideas of a consciousness that was ancient, powerful, and utterly alien to human experience. It spoke of the silence between the stars, of the geometry of decay, and of the amusing brief vibrations of the soft, temporary ones. The soft, temporary ones. That was them. That was humanity. Aris Thorne never released his findings. He knew he would be dismissed as a crank, his career ruined. He erased the recordings and shelved the project, citing inconclusive data and equipment malfunction. He took a sabbatical and never returned to field research. He learned that there are places in the world, quiet, ancient places, that are inhabited by intelligences so old and so different from us that their very thoughts are a language of pure mathematics, and their laughter is the sound of a god amusing itself with the fleeting, terrified scurrying of insects. He learned that in the heart of the redwood forest, among the silent, patient giants, lives something that has been watching humanity for millennia, and it finds us and our brief, noisy existence deeply, deeply funny. Story 7. The Wendigo of Isle Royale. Our 7th story takes us to the cold, isolated, and hauntingly beautiful Isle Royale National Park, a remote island archipelago in the frigid waters of Lake Superior. This account comes from a Park Service biologist named Dr. Evelyn Reed, who was part of the famous wolf-moose predator-prey study, one of the longest-running scientific studies in the world. In the brutal winter of 2017, during a period when the island's wolf population had dwindled to near extinction, Evelyn and her partner encountered a predator that wasn't in any of their textbooks. An ancient, malevolent force that the local Ojibwe people had warned about for centuries. Isle Royale in winter is one of the most isolated places in North America. The tourist ferries stop running in the fall, and the island is cut off from the mainland by a treacherous, often frozen expanse of Lake Superior. For the handful of researchers who overwinter there, it is a world of profound silence, deep snow, and utter solitude. Evelyn and her senior partner, a grizzled, no-nonsense biologist named Frank, were there to document the state of the island's two remaining wolves. An aging male and female pair who were father and daughter and the last of their kind on the island. Their base was a small rustic cabin at Wendigo Ranger Station, a name that, in retrospect, felt like a grim and terrible irony. Their work involved long, arduous treks on snowshoes through the deep snow, tracking the movements of the moose population and searching for any signs of the two lone wolves. The island's ecosystem was out of balance. With the wolves nearly gone, the moose population had exploded, and the massive animals were beginning to starve, having overbrowsed their food sources. The forest was filled with the gaunt, spectral forms of starving moose, their ribs showing, their movements slow and listless. A sense of sickness and decay hung over the island. The strangeness began with the disappearances, not of people but of the moose carcasses. Evelyn and Frank would locate a moose that had succumbed to starvation, tag its location with GPS, and plan to return the next day to perform a necropsy. But when they returned, the carcass would be gone, not just partially eaten or dragged away by scavengers like foxes or eagles. It would be completely gone, a 1,000-pound animal, vanished from the middle of a wide, open snowfield, with no drag marks, no blood, and only a single set of tracks leading away. The tracks were the most baffling part. They were not wolf tracks, nor were they from a bear awakened from hibernation. They were long, narrow, and looked disturbingly like the tracks of a large, barefoot human, but with elongated toes that ended in sharp, deep impressions, as if from claws. And the stride was immense, sometimes 10 or 12 feet between steps, an impossible distance for any bipedal creature. Frank, a man who had spent 40 winters on the island, was deeply unsettled. "I've never seen anything like it," he muttered, staring at the line of impossible tracks disappearing into the thick spruce forest. "It's like something just picked it up and walked away." A few days later, they found the first of the trees. Deep in the island's interior, they stumbled upon a gruesome, ritualistic-looking sight. A dozen moose carcasses in various states of decay had been wedged high up in the branches of the tall, sturdy spruce trees, some as high as 30 or 40 feet off the ground. It was a grotesque larder, a pantry of the dead. The effort required to lift these massive animals and secure them in the high branches was staggering, far beyond the capabilities of any known predator, including humans. The same long, narrow clawed tracks were everywhere on the ground below. It was then that Evelyn remembered the stories she had read in the park's historical archives, accounts from the Ojibwe people who had once lived on the island. They spoke of the Wendigo, a malevolent spirit of the cold and starvation. The legend said that a Wendigo is born when a human, lost in the winter wilderness, resorts to cannibalism to survive. The act damns them, transforming them into a tall, emaciated, monstrous creature with an insatiable hunger for human flesh. They were said to be unnaturally fast, strong, and cunning, able to mimic human voices to lure their prey, and they were known to store their victims' bodies in high trees. Evelyn, a woman of science, had dismissed it as folklore. But standing in that silent, frozen grove, surrounded by the hanging, frozen bodies of the moose, the old stories felt chillingly real. That night the storm hit. A classic Lake Superior blizzard descended on the island, a whiteout that reduced visibility to zero and trapped them in their cabin. The wind shrieked like a banshee, rattling the small cabin to its foundations. It was during the height of the storm that they heard the first sound. It was a voice calling from the storm. It was faint at first, almost lost in the howl of the wind. It was the voice of a woman crying for help. "Please, help me, my snowmobile broke down, I'm freezing." Evelyn and Frank looked at each other, their faces grim. They were the only two people on this entire end of the island. There were no other researchers, no tourists, no one. It was impossible. "It's the wind," Frank said, his voice lacking conviction. "Just the wind playing tricks." But the voice grew louder, closer. It was now just outside the cabin, screaming for help, begging them to open the door. And then the voice changed. It became the voice of the park superintendent, a man they both knew well, based on the mainland. "Evelyn! Frank, it's Dave. We had an emergency landing. My pilot is injured. Open the door." Evelyn almost moved towards the door. The voice was so convincing, so filled with genuine panic. But Frank grabbed her arm, his face a mask of terror. "Don't," he whispered. "Look." He pointed to the small frost-covered window in the cabin door. Evelyn wiped away a patch of frost and peered out. In the swirling chaos of the blizzard, she could see a figure standing on their porch. It was impossibly tall and thin, its skeletal frame barely visible through the driving snow. It was pale white, the color of bone, and it seemed to have no hair or clothes, its emaciated form somehow impervious to the sub-zero temperatures. It was standing on two long jointed legs, and its long, stick-like arms ended in black talon-like fingers. It had no face, only a smooth expanse of skin where its features should have been, except for a jagged, lipless mouth that was stretched wide, from which the superintendent's voice was still screaming for help. As they watched, paralyzed with horror, the creature slowly raised one of its long arms and tapped on the window with a single black claw. Tap, tap. Tap. The sound was quiet, almost delicate, but it was more terrifying than any scream. Then it spoke again, but this time, it's Story 8, The Watcher of Acadia. Our 8th story takes us to the rugged, windswept coast of Maine and the dramatic landscapes of Acadia National Park. This account comes from a lighthouse keeper named Samuel Blackwood, a man who in the final years of the 20th century was one of the last civilian keepers of the historic Bass Harbor Head Light. In the autumn of 1998, during a series of powerful nor'easters, Samuel's solitary watch was disturbed by a presence that was not of the land or the sea, but of the ancient salt-sprayed rock itself. The Bass Harbor Head Light stands on a dramatic rocky headland at the southern tip of Mount Desert Island. It's one of the most photographed lighthouses in New England, a quintessential beacon against the raw power of the Atlantic. In 1998, the light was automated, but due to its critical location and the harshness of the weather, the Coast Guard still employed a civilian keeper to live on site, to maintain the equipment and to serve as a human pair of eyes during severe storms. Samuel was that keeper. He was a quiet, solitary man in his late 60s, a former fisherman who had lost his boat and his crew to the sea years earlier. The lighthouse was his penance and his sanctuary. He had lived in the keeper's house, which was attached to the lighthouse tower, for over a decade. He knew the rhythm of the tides, the moods of the ocean, and the sound of every wave that crashed against the pink granite cliffs below. He was a man in tune with his environment, a man who believed in the tangible, in the salt spray on his face and the solid rock beneath his feet. He did not believe in ghosts. The series of storms began in late October. A train of powerful nor'easters rolled in off the Atlantic, battering the coast with hurricane-force winds and torrential rain. For 2 weeks, the lighthouse was an island in a sea of chaos. Samuel was kept busy, ensuring the light and the foghorn were operational, reporting weather conditions and keeping a vigilant watch for any ships in distress. It was during the third and most violent of these storms that the strange occurrences began. Samuel was in the lantern room at the top of the tower, cleaning the massive Fresnel lens when he saw it. In a brief, brilliant flash of lightning, he saw a figure standing on the furthest, most treacherous point of the rocky outcrop below, a spot that was being constantly pounded by waves the size of houses. It was a tall, dark figure, unnaturally still against the raging storm, its form silhouetted against the churning white foam of the sea. Samuel's first thought was that someone had been washed ashore, a survivor from a wrecked boat. He grabbed his powerful signal lantern and his emergency radio and rushed down the winding stairs. He burst out into the storm, the wind and rain tearing at him, and made his way carefully onto the slippery rocks. But when he reached the spot where he had seen the figure, there was no one there. There were no footprints, no signs that anyone had been there at all. The waves crashed over the spot with a thunderous roar, a maelstrom of water that would have swept any person away in an instant. He dismissed it as a trick of the light, a phantom created by the lightning and the spray. But a deep sense of unease settled over him. The next night, the storm raged on. Samuel was in the small watchroom just below the lantern, monitoring the radar, when he heard a sound over the howl of the wind. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping on the thick glass of the lantern room above him. Tap, tap, tap. The lantern room was over 100 feet in the air, its exterior a sheer, vertical wall of stone. There was no ledge, no foothold, nothing for a person or anything else to stand on. His heart pounding, Samuel climbed the final steep ladder into the lantern room. The massive, rotating lens cast sweeping beams of light into the stormy darkness. The room was empty, but as he stood there, the tapping started again, this time on the window right in front of him. Tap, tap, tap. He peered out into the maelstrom but could see nothing but the driving rain and the blackness of the night. Then another flash of lightning illuminated the sky, and for a split second he saw a face pressed against the other side of the glass. It was a long, narrow face with no discernible features. No eyes, no nose, just a smooth, pale, wet-looking surface like a water-worn stone. And from the bottom of this blank face a lipless slit opened, and it smiled at him before the darkness swallowed it again. Samuel stumbled back from the window, his breath catching in his throat. He fled the lantern room, locking the heavy iron door at the bottom of the stairs. A futile gesture, he knew, but one his terrified mind demanded. The siege continued for the duration of the storm. The tapping on the lantern glass was a constant, maddening companion. Sometimes it was soft and rhythmic, other times it was a frantic, angry drumming. He began to hear other sounds too. A low, guttural humming that seemed to vibrate through the very stones of the lighthouse, a sound that was deeper than the roar of the ocean, and whispers. Faint, sibilant whispers that seemed to come from the drains, from the chimney, from the cracks in the old stone walls. The whispers spoke of the sea, of the cold, dark depths, of ships lost and sailors drowned. They spoke his name, and the names of his crewmates who had died on his boat all those years ago. Samuel, a man who had faced the worst the Atlantic could throw at him, was slowly being driven mad. He barricaded himself in the small living quarters of the keeper's house, blocking the doors and windows with furniture. He stopped answering the radio calls from the Coast Guard. He just sat in the dark, listening to the tapping and the whispers, waiting for the storm to end. On the 5th night of the siege, the storm reached its peak. The wind shrieked like a tortured soul, and the waves were so powerful they were breaking over the top of the cliff, sending spray and foam against the windows of the keeper's house itself. The tapping on the lantern room glass stopped. It was replaced by a new, more terrifying sound, a heavy scraping noise on the stone walls of the tower, as if something large and hard was dragging itself up the side of the lighthouse. Scrape, drag, scrape, it was getting closer. Samuel could hear it, moving down the tower towards the keeper's house. He huddled in the corner of the room, clutching an old, rusty gaff hook, the only weapon he had. The scraping stopped directly outside his window. The whispers were loud now. Right on the other side of the glass, the voices of his drowned friends calling his name, begging him to come out to join them in the cold, quiet peace of the sea. "It's not so bad, Sam," his best friend's voice whispered. "It doesn't hurt for long." "We're waiting for you." Then a tremendous force struck the window. The heavy storm shutter splintered and the thick glass behind it cracked. Through the crack he could see it. A long, pale, multi-jointed limb like the leg of a crab or a spider, but the size of a man's arm, was pressing against the glass. It was covered in the same smooth, wet, stone-like skin as the face he had seen. It pushed back, and the glass began to shatter. In that moment, something inside Samuel snapped. The fear was replaced by a sudden, defiant rage. This was his lighthouse, his sanctuary. He would not be taken from it. He roared, a sound of pure primal fury, and charged the window, swinging the heavy gaff hook. He smashed it through the remaining glass and drove the sharp point deep into the pale limb. There was no scream of pain. There was only a sudden, deafening shriek of static, a sound like 1,000 radios all tuned to a dead channel at once. The limb recoiled violently, and the shriek faded into the howl of the storm. The next morning, the storm had passed. The sun was shining, the sea was calm, and the world was quiet. Samuel, exhausted but alive, went outside to inspect the damage. The storm shutter was broken and the window was shattered, but there was no other sign of the night's events. There were no tracks, no body, nothing. But as he looked at the granite cliffs below the lighthouse, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The cliffs, which he had known for years as a jumble of natural, sea-worn rock, had changed. Carved into the face of the rock, in a spot that would be visible only from the lantern room of the lighthouse, was a face. A long, narrow, featureless face, with a thin, lipless slit of a mouth, its expression one of silent, eternal rage. The Coast Guard arrived later that day to check on him and assess the storm damage. Samuel told them the damage was from a piece of debris thrown by the waves. He never spoke of the tapping, the whispers, or the thing that had tried to break into his home. He knew no one would believe him. He served as the keeper for 1 more year, but the piece was gone. Every time he was in the lantern room, he could see that hateful carved face staring up at him from the rocks. And on stormy nights, he could still hear the faint sound of tapping on the glass. A quiet, patient reminder that the thing was still out there, watching, waiting. He retired in 1999, and the keeper's house has been vacant ever since. The official reason is that a civilian keeper is no longer necessary. But the locals who live near the lighthouse know the truth. They say that something was awakened during those storms of '98. An ancient guardian of the coast that sees the lighthouse not as a beacon of safety, but as an unwelcome intrusion on its eternal lonely watch. And it is still there, a part of the rock, a part of the sea, waiting for the next storm and the next keeper. Conclusion. The trail grows cold and the sun dips below the horizon. The stories we've shared tonight are a stark reminder that our national parks, these vast cathedrals of nature, are more than just scenic landscapes. They are ancient, powerful places governed by laws far older than mankind. They are reservoirs of a deep and primal wildness that does not always welcome visitors. From the enforced unnatural silence of the Great Smoky Mountains to the malevolent sun-baked glare of Zion's high cliffs, from the ancient whispering steam of Yellowstone to the hungry, patient cold of Isle Royale. These accounts from park rangers, scientists, and experienced adventurers all point to the same unsettling truth. We are guests in these lands, and sometimes we overstay our welcome. These are not places to be feared, but they are places to be respected with a profound and cautious humility. They hold wonders beyond our imagination, but they also hold entities that defy our understanding. Beings that can wear the voices of the lost, that can move unseen through the oldest forests, and that watch from the shadows with an intelligence that is not human. So the next time you stand at a trailhead gazing into the beautiful silent wilderness, remember these stories. Remember that every rustle of leaves might not be the wind. Every distant call might not be a bird. and the feeling of being watched might be more than just a feeling. Thank you for walking with us into the heart of America's haunted wilderness. Until next time, stay on the trail, trust your instincts, and be careful what you answer to when it calls your name from the deep woods. This is Blood Moon Stories, signing off.